The Mississippi River ran red with more than mud in the spring of 1863. Confederate artillery shells screamed across the water from the bluffs of Vicksburg, sending Union gunboats scrambling for cover behind the river's bend. Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the deck of his headquarters boat, watching the smoke rise from the fortress city that had become his obsession. The fate of the entire Civil War might well hang in the balance of what happened in this seemingly impregnable stronghold. Vicksburg perched on the high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, like a medieval castle, its cannons commanding every approach. The city had earned its nickname as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Through months of successful resistance to Union attempts to capture it, control of Vicksburg meant control of the Mississippi River, and control of the river meant cutting the Confederacy in two, severing Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the rebel states. Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, the Pennsylvania-born Confederate commander defending Vicksburg, understood the stakes as clearly as Grant did from his headquarters in the Warren County courthouse. Pemberton coordinated the defense of what President Jefferson Davis had called the nail-head that holds the South's halves together. The irony was not lost on him that he, a Northerner by birth, now stood as one of the Confederacy's most crucial defenders. The citizens of Vicksburg had already endured months of bombardment and shortages. Women and children had taken to living in caves carved into the hillsides, emerging only when the shelling stopped. The sound of incoming artillery had become as familiar as church bells once were. Marion Webster Lowborough, a resident who kept a detailed diary of the siege, would later write of nights spent listening to the singing of shells overhead and the constant thunder of guns that never seemed to cease. Grant had tried everything to take the city. Direct assault had failed catastrophically at Chickasaw Bayou in December of 1862, where William Tecumseh Sherman's forces had been repulsed with heavy casualties. Attempts to bypass the city by digging canals had been frustrated by the river's engineering challenges and Confederate harassment. The famous DeSoto Point Canal project, intended to redirect the Mississippi's flow away from Vicksburg's guns, had consumed months of backbreaking labor only to fail when the river refused to cooperate with Union engineering. Now, in May of 1863, Grant had settled on a different strategy entirely. Rather than attack Vicksburg head-on, he would surround it completely and starve it into submission. The Union commander had learned from his previous failures that Vicksburg's natural defenses made it nearly impregnable to direct assault, but every fortress had one weakness: the need for supplies. The stage was set for one of the most significant sieges in American military history. As Grant's forces tightened their grip around the city, the 47,000 Confederate defenders and the civilian population found themselves trapped between the Union Army and the river. What followed would test the resolve of both sides and ultimately determine whether the United States would remain united or be permanently divided. The siege of Vicksburg was about to begin in earnest, and with it would come a level of suffering and determination that would echo through American history. The Union noose around Vicksburg drew tighter with each passing day in May of 1863. Grant's strategy of encirclement required precise coordination among his corps' commanders, and by the middle of the month, his 7,000 troops had established a semicircular line of entrenchments that stretched from the Mississippi River north of the city to the river south of it. The Confederate garrison and civilians were now completely cut off from outside supply lines. Major General John Alexander McClernand's 13th Corps held the Union left flank, stretching along the river south of Vicksburg. The ambitious politician-turned-general had clashed repeatedly with Grant over strategy and credit for victories. But even McClernand understood that the siege required disciplined cooperation. His men had dug elaborate earthworks that snaked through the rolling terrain, each position carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire. In the center of the Union line, Major General James Birdseye McPherson's 17th Corps occupied the most dangerous positions, directly facing Vicksburg's strongest fortifications. McPherson, one of Grant's most trusted subordinaries, had positioned his artillery to maintain constant pressure on the Confederate defenses, while his engineers worked around the clock to dig approach trenches closer to the enemy lines. Sherman's 15th Corps completed the encirclement on the Union right, extending the siege lines to the river north of the city. The red-haired general had learned bitter lessons from his previous failed assault on Vicksburg, and now embraced Grant's patient siege tactics. His corps faced some of the most challenging terrain, where Confederate engineers had constructed a maze of interconnected redoubts and rifle pits inside Vicksburg. The situation grew more desperate daily. Pemberton's defenders had adequate ammunition for their artillery and small arms, but food supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. The Confederate commander faced an impossible dilemma. He could attempt to break out of the encirclement, but doing so would mean abandoning the strategic position that Jefferson Davis had ordered him to hold at all costs. The civilian population bore the brunt of the siege's hardships. Families who had once enjoyed comfortable middle-class lives now competed with rats for scraps of food. Horses, mules, and dogs disappeared from the streets as desperate residents turned to any available protein source. According to historical accounts documented in the Vicksburg Daily Citizen, some citizens had resorted to eating leather and tree bark to stave off starvation. The cave life that had begun during the earlier bombardments now became a permanent way of existence for many families. Hundreds of caves had been carved into the yellow clay hills surrounding the city, some elaborate enough to include multiple rooms and furniture salvaged from abandoned homes. The caves provided protection from the constant artillery fire, but they could not shield families from hunger, disease, and the psychological trauma of prolonged siege. Confederate morale within the garrison remained surprisingly high despite the deteriorating conditions. Pemberton's soldiers understood that they stood at a crucial point in the war's outcome. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns who had developed a professional pride in their ability to withstand hardship. They continued to man their positions with determination, sniping at Union soldiers who showed themselves above the entrenchments and launching occasional raids to disrupt enemy siege operations. Grant, meanwhile, faced pressure from Washington to conclude the siege quickly. President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton worried that a prolonged siege would allow Confederate forces elsewhere to concentrate and potentially relieve Vicksburg. The Union commander resisted these pressures, understanding that patience would ultimately prove more effective than costly assaults. He had learned from the bloody failure of his May 19th and 22nd attacks on the city's defenses, where Union casualties had been horrific while Confederate losses remained minimal. As June arrived, both sides settled into the grim routine of siege warfare, knowing that time would ultimately determine the victor. June of 1863 brought a new dimension to the siege of Vicksburg, as Union engineers began their most ambitious and dangerous project yet, undermining the Confederate fortifications through underground tunnels. The war above ground had settled into a deadly routine of sniper fire and artillery exchanges. But beneath the Mississippi soil, a different kind of battle was about to unfold. Colonel Andrew Hickenlooper of the 5th Ohio Infantry had proposed the mining operation to McPherson, drawing on his pre-war experience as a civil engineer. The plan called for digging a tunnel beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, one of the strongest Confederate positions protecting the Jackson Road approach to Vicksburg. Once the tunnel reached beneath the fort, Union engineers would pack it with explosives and literally blow a hole in the Confederate defenses. The mining work began in late May, with soldiers from the 45th Illinois Infantry volunteering for the dangerous underground duty, working in shifts around the clock. The miners carved a tunnel 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, extending it slowly toward the Confederate position. The work required absolute silence to avoid detection by Confederate listeners, who pressed their ears to the ground searching for the telltale sounds of digging. Inside Vicksburg, Pemberton's engineers suspected the Union mining efforts and began counter-mining operations of their own. Confederate soldiers dug listening posts and attempted to locate the Union tunnel so they could either collapse it or break into it for a deadly underground confrontation. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical danger, with both sides knowing that a successful mine could determine the siege's outcome. The civilian population suffering reached new depths as June progressed. Food stocks had dwindled to virtually nothing, and cases of scurvy and other nutrition-related diseases became commonplace. Children who had once played in Vicksburg's tree-lined streets now appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, their growth stunted by months of inadequate nutrition. The city's hospitals, already overwhelmed with military casualties, struggled to treat civilians suffering from malnutrition and disease. Merriam-Webster Loughborough's diary entries from this period, as referenced in historical documentation from the Vicksburg National Military Park Archives, provide harrowing details of daily life during the siege's middle phase. She described families dividing single hardtack crackers among multiple people and a constant search for anything edible. Even the city's cats had largely disappeared. Though whether from starvation or as food sources remained unclear, Confederate soldiers faced their own nutritional crisis. Daily rations had been reduced to a handful of corn or rice occasionally, supplemented with small portions of bacon or beef when available. The lack of proper nutrition began affecting the garrison's ability to maintain effective defensive operations. Soldiers reported increasing incidents of night blindness, dental problems, and general weakness that made manual labor increasingly difficult. Despite these hardships, Confederate morale showed remarkable resilience. Many soldiers and civilians had developed an almost religious faith in their cause and their ability to outlast the Union siege. Letters home, when they could be smuggled out through the Union lines, often expressed confidence that relief forces would eventually arrive, or that the Yankees would grow tired of the siege and withdraw. Grant faced his own challenges in maintaining the siege. His supply lines stretched back through hostile territory, making them vulnerable to Confederate cavalry raids. The Union commander had to detach significant forces to guard wagon trains and river transports bringing supplies to his army. Moreover, the summer heat and humidity of Mississippi began taking a toll on Union soldiers, many of whom came from cooler northern climates. The general's relationship with his corps commanders remained complicated by personal ambitions and political considerations. McClernand continued to chafe under Grant's authority and sought opportunities to enhance his own reputation at his superior's expense. Sherman, conversely, had developed complete confidence in Grant's leadership and became one of his most reliable subordinates. As June drew to a close, both armies prepared for what many sensed would be the siege's climactic phase. The Union mine neared completion, while Confederate defenders worked frantically to locate and neutralize the threat. The outcome of the underground war would soon determine whether Vicksburg fell to Union explosives or continued its stubborn resistance. The morning of June 25, 1863, dawned with deceptive calm over the siege lines at Vicksburg. Union soldiers in the trenches facing the 3rd Louisiana Redon went about their normal routine of cleaning weapons and preparing for another day of siege warfare, unaware that beneath their feet lay 2,200 pounds of black powder, packed into a chamber at the end of a tunnel that had taken weeks to complete. Colonel Hickenlooper made his final inspections of the mine as the sun climbed higher. The tunnel extended 150 feet from the Union lines, directly beneath the Confederate strong point, where his engineers had carefully positioned the explosives to cause maximum damage to the rebel fortifications. The fuse line had been tested multiple times, and assault troops from Logan's division waited in their approach trenches, ready to storm through whatever breach the explosion might create. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Hickenlooper lit the fuse. The flame disappeared into the tunnel's darkness, while hundreds of Union soldiers held their breath in anticipation. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness as officers checked their pocket watches and wondered if the fuse had failed. Then, at exactly 3:26, the earth itself seemed to convulse in a massive volcanic eruption. The explosion lifted the entire 3rd Louisiana Redon into the air in a column of earth, timber, and human bodies that rose more than 100 feet before raining debris across a wide area. The sound of the blast echoed across the Mississippi River and was heard clearly in the Union camps miles away. A crater 40 feet deep and 60 feet across marked where the Confederate fort had stood just moments before. Union assault troops charged forward immediately, led by the 103rd Illinois Infantry and supported by elements from several other regiments. They poured through the breach created by the explosion and engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat with stunned Confederate defenders who had survived the blast. For a moment, it appeared that Grant's mining strategy had achieved the breakthrough that months of conventional siege tactics had failed to produce. But Pemberton's defenders demonstrated the resilience that had made Vicksburg so difficult to capture. Confederate reserves rushed to contain the breach while artillery from nearby positions opened devastating enfilade fire on the Union attackers trapped in the crater. The attacking Federal troops found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire with limited cover and no room to maneuver effectively. Brigadier General Lewis Hebert, commanding the Confederate forces in this sector, quickly organized a counterattack that drove the Union soldiers back from the crater's rim. His Louisiana and Mississippi troops fought with desperate courage, knowing that allowing the Union forces to exploit the breach could mean the fall of the entire city. The fighting continued for hours as both sides poured reinforcements into the confined space around the explosion site. The mine's explosion had achieved tactical surprise, but failed to provide the strategic breakthrough Grant needed. By evening, Confederate forces had re-established a defensive line across the crater. using debris from the explosion to create new breastworks. Union casualties from the assault were significant, while Confederate losses, though including the garrison of the original Reading, were manageable within Pemberton's overall defensive scheme. The failure of the mining operation marked a turning point in Grant's approach to the siege. The Union commander realized that even extraordinary measures like underground explosives could not force a quick end to Vicksburg's resistance. The city's defenders had demonstrated an ability to adapt to whatever tactics the Union Army employed, suggesting that only complete starvation would ultimately compel surrender. Inside Vicksburg, the successful defense of the crater breach provided a much-needed morale boost to both soldiers and civilians. The explosion had been terrifying in its power and destructiveness, but the garrison's ability to contain its effects proved that Confederate forces could still match Union innovation. With their own determination and tactical skill, news of the mining attempt and its aftermath spread quickly through both armies. As detailed in contemporary accounts preserved in regimental histories and soldiers' letters home, Union soldiers expressed grudging admiration for their opponents' tenacity, while Confederate troops gained confidence from their successful defense against yet another Union stratagem. As July began, both sides understood that the siege had entered its final phase. Grant would rely on time and starvation rather than tactical innovations, while Pemberton faced the grim reality that his supplies could not last much longer. The great explosion had failed to break Vicksburg's will, but it had demonstrated that the city's fate was now measured in weeks rather than months. July of 1863 brought the siege of Vicksburg to its most desperate phase as Confederate supplies dwindled to virtually nothing and civilian suffering reached levels that would haunt the city's memory for generations. The failure of Grant's mining operations had convinced the Union commander that patience, rather than tactical innovation, would ultimately deliver victory inside the besieged city. Pemberton faced the agonizing reality that his garrison and the civilian population were slowly starving. The Confederate food situation had become catastrophic by the first week of July. Daily rations for soldiers had been reduced to a handful of corn and occasional pieces of bacon so small they could barely be seen. Horses and mules, essential for moving artillery and supplies, began dying from malnutrition, further reducing the garrison's mobility and effectiveness. The sight of dead animals in the streets became commonplace. Though their meat was quickly claimed by desperate residents, civilian conditions were even worse than military ones. Families that had once lived comfortable middle-class lives now competed desperately for any available food source. Children showed visible signs of malnutrition, their faces gaunt and their eyes unnaturally large in their shrunken faces. Elderly residents, already vulnerable to the siege's hardships, began dying at increasing rates from starvation-related illnesses. The cave life that had begun as protection from artillery bombardment now served as shelter for families who had lost their homes to shell damage or had been forced to abandon them due to their proximity to Union lines. Some caves had been expanded into elaborate underground communities, complete with crude furniture and attempts at domestic normalcy. However, no amount of organization could address the fundamental problem of food scarcity. Merriam-Webster Lowbrow's diary, as preserved in the Vicksburg National Military Park Historical Collection, provides heartbreaking details of this period. She described mothers unable to produce milk for their infants due to their own malnutrition, and children who had forgotten what it felt like to have a full stomach. The psychological impact of constant hunger was as devastating as its physical effects, creating a climate of desperation that threatened to undermine civilian morale entirely. Confederate soldiers demonstrated remarkable discipline despite their own suffering. Desertion rates, while increasing, remained lower than might have been expected given the circumstances. Many troops had developed a fatalistic acceptance of their situation, believing that their sacrifice served a cause greater than their individual survival. Letters home, when they could be smuggled through Union lines, often emphasized duty and honor rather than personal hardship. Pemberton faced impossible decisions daily, as he allocated dwindling resources between military necessity and civilian survival. Artillery ammunition remained adequate, but without food for the gunners, even the best supplied cannon became useless. The Confederate commander had begun considering the previously unthinkable option of surrender, though he knew such a decision would end his military career and potentially his life. If Jefferson Davis viewed it as treason, medical conditions within the city deteriorated rapidly as malnutrition weakened immune systems. and made residents susceptible to diseases that would normally pose little threat. Scurvy became widespread due to the lack of fresh vegetables, while typhoid and dysentery spread through the crowded cave communities, where sanitation was nearly impossible to maintain. The city's doctors, themselves weakened by inadequate nutrition, struggled to treat patients with virtually no medical supplies. Grant's Union forces, while better supplied than their Confederate opponents, faced their own challenges maintaining the siege. The Mississippi summer heat and humidity created health problems for soldiers from northern states, while the constant threat of sniper fire and artillery bombardment maintained psychological pressure on the besieging troops. Nevertheless, Union morale remained generally high as soldiers understood that time was working in their favor. The Union commander had established an efficient supply system that brought regular shipments of food, ammunition, and medical supplies up the Mississippi River from Memphis and other northern controlled cities. This logistical advantage, more than any tactical brilliance, would ultimately determine the siege's outcome. Grant's ability to maintain his army indefinitely contrasted sharply with Pemberton's dwindling resources. Attempts at relief from outside the siege perimeter had failed to materialize. General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in Mississippi, lacked sufficient troops to challenge Grant's army directly. Johnston's small force remained at Jackson, unable to mount the large-scale relief operation that might have saved Vicksburg. The Confederate High Command's failure to prioritize Vicksburg's relief would later be recognized as one of the war's major strategic errors. As the siege entered its final days, both commanders understood that surrender was becoming inevitable. The question was no longer whether Vicksburg would fall, but when Pemberton would acknowledge that continued resistance served no military purpose and only increased civilian suffering. The morning of July 3, 1863, dawned with an unusual silence over the siege. Lines at Vicksburg, the constant artillery exchanges and sniper fire that had characterized the previous weeks seemed muted, as if both armies sensed that the long ordeal was approaching its conclusion. Inside the besieged city, Lieutenant General Pemberton faced the most difficult decision of his military career as he prepared to meet with his senior officers to discuss the unthinkable surrender. The Confederate commander had received disturbing reports throughout the night from his subordinates detailing the garrison's deteriorating condition. Colonel Edward Higgins, commanding the river batteries, reported that his gunners were so weakened by hunger that they could barely serve their pieces effectively. Brigadier General John Stevens Bowen, one of Pemberton's most trusted division commanders, had observed soldiers collapsing at their posts from exhaustion and malnutrition. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Pemberton convened a council of war in the Warren County Courthouse basement, one of the few spaces in the city that provided relative safety from Union artillery. The assembled officers represented the cream of Confederate military leadership in the Western Theater, but their haggard faces and worn uniforms reflected the toll that 47 days of siege had exacted on defenders and commanders alike. General Bowen spoke first, his voice hoarse from weeks of constant strain. He reported that his division could no longer maintain effective defensive positions due to widespread illness and weakness among the troops. Men were fainting during routine duties, and the lack of food had created a situation where continued resistance might result in the complete collapse of military discipline. Colonel Samuel Henry Lockett, Pemberton's chief engineer, provided equally grim assessments of the city's physical defenses. Weeks of constant bombardment had created numerous breaches in the fortification lines that could no longer be properly repaired due to the lack of healthy men available for manual labor. More critically, the engineering expertise required for defensive improvements was being lost as skilled soldiers succumbed to disease and exhaustion. The civilian situation had reached levels that horrified even hardened military officers. Reports from the cave communities described scenes of desperation that challenged every principle of civilized society. Mothers were unable to feed their children. Elderly residents were dying daily from starvation-related illnesses, and the city's social fabric was beginning to unravel. Under the pressure of prolonged suffering, Pemberton listened to these reports with growing anguish, understanding that his duty as a military commander conflicted with his responsibilities as a human being. Jefferson Davis had ordered him to hold Vicksburg at all costs, but those costs now included the systematic starvation of innocent civilians, whose only crime was living in a strategically important city. At noon, Pemberton made his decision. He would seek terms from Grant for the surrender of Vicksburg, hoping that the Union commander's reputation for magnanimity toward defeated enemies would extend to the civilian population as well as the military garrison. The Confederate general understood that this decision would end his career and likely result in his court-martial, but he could no longer justify prolonging civilian suffering for military objectives that had become impossible to achieve. White flags appeared along the Confederate lines at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, creating a moment of stunned silence among Union soldiers, who had grown accustomed to the siege's daily routine of violence and death. Word spread quickly through Grant's army that the Confederate commander was seeking a meeting to discuss surrender terms. After nearly 2 months of patient siege warfare, the Union Army was finally approaching its ultimate objective. Grant agreed to meet with Pemberton between the opposing lines at 3 o'clock. The two generals, accompanied by small groups of staff officers, met in the shade of a large oak tree that would later become famous as the site where Vicksburg's fate was decided. Both men understood the historical significance of their meeting, knowing that the outcome would influence the entire course of the Civil War. The negotiations were brief and businesslike. Pemberton sought terms that would allow his officers to retain their sidearms and personal property while providing assurances about the treatment of civilians. Grant, eager to conclude the siege and redeploy his army for other operations, agreed to relatively generous terms that would parole the Confederate garrison, rather than transport them to northern prison camps. As evening approached on July 3rd, both armies prepared for the formal surrender ceremony that would take place the following morning. The siege of Vicksburg was finally ending, but its impact on the Civil War and American history was just beginning to be understood. The fall of the Gibraltar of the Confederacy would give the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy in two, marking the beginning of the end for the Southern cause. The morning of July 4th, 1863, brought an end to the siege of Vicksburg as Confederate forces formally surrendered to Grant's Army of the Tennessee. The symbolic significance of surrender occurring on Independence Day was not lost on participants from either side, marking both the Union's rebirth and the Confederacy's effective division into two separate and weakened parts. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Confederate soldiers began the formal process of stacking their arms and surrendering their battle flags to Union forces. The ceremony took place along the Jackson Road, where some of the siege's fiercest fighting had occurred during the previous weeks. Despite their defeat, Confederate troops maintained their military bearing and dignity, earning the respect of their Union counterparts, who understood the courage required to endure such a prolonged siege. Pemberton's garrison totaled approximately 29,000 soldiers, including officers and enlisted men from Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and other Confederate states. The surrendering force also included significant quantities of artillery, small arms, and military equipment that would strengthen Union capabilities in future campaigns. More importantly for the war's strategic outcome, the fall of Vicksburg freed Grant's entire army for redeployment to other theaters of operation. The civilian population emerged from their caves and makeshift shelters to witness the surrender ceremony, their appearances shocking even hardened Union soldiers. Months of inadequate nutrition had left visible marks on men, women, and children who had once represented the prosperous middle class of antebellum Mississippi. Many Union troops shared their rations with Confederate civilians, demonstrating the humanity that could survive even the brutal realities of Civil War. Grant's treatment of the defeated garrison reflected his understanding of broader strategic objectives beyond simple military victory. Rather than imprisoning the Confederate soldiers, he chose to parole them on their promise not to take up arms again until properly exchanged. This decision served multiple purposes. It avoided the logistical burden of feeding and housing nearly 30,000 prisoners. It demonstrated Union magnanimity that might encourage other Confederate surrenders, and it allowed Grant's army to remain mobile for future operations. The fall of Vicksburg completed the Union's control of the Mississippi River, fulfilling Abraham Lincoln's strategic vision of splitting the Confederacy along its most important internal waterway. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were now effectively cut off from the rest of the Confederate states, unable to contribute their agricultural products and manpower to the Southern war effort. As Lincoln reportedly said upon learning of Vicksburg's surrender, "The father of waters again goes unvexed to the sea." News of Vicksburg's fall reached the North just as reports arrived of the Union victory at Gettysburg. creating a wave of celebration that marked the war's turning point. The simultaneous victories in Pennsylvania and Mississippi demonstrated that Union forces could win decisive battles in both the Eastern and Western theaters, suggesting that Confederate defeat was becoming inevitable rather than merely possible. For the Confederacy, the loss of Vicksburg represented a catastrophic strategic failure that could not be easily remedied. The city's defenses had consumed enormous resources in men and materials, while its fall freed Union forces for operations elsewhere while denying Confederate armies access to the Trans-Mississippi region's resources. Jefferson Davis's insistence on holding Vicksburg at all costs had ultimately resulted in losing both the city and the army defending it. The siege's human cost extended far beyond military casualties to include the civilian population that had endured months of bombardment, starvation, and disease. Post-war memoirs and historical studies, including research conducted by the Vicksburg National Military Park, documented the long-term effects of the siege on the city's residents. Many families never fully recovered from the nutritional deficiencies and psychological trauma experienced during the summer of 1863. Grant's successful conduct of the Vicksburg campaign established his reputation as the Union's most effective general and led directly to his promotion to command all Union armies. The campaign demonstrated his ability to adapt tactics to circumstances, maintain strategic focus despite political pressures, and treat defeated enemies with dignity that served broader war aims. These qualities would serve him well in his subsequent role as General-in-Chief and eventually as President. The Siege of Vicksburg became a defining moment in American military history, demonstrating both the effectiveness of patient siege warfare and the terrible human costs of civil conflict. The campaign's success validated Union strategy while revealing Confederate weaknesses that would contribute to eventual Southern defeat. More broadly, Vicksburg showed how modern warfare could blur the lines between combatants and civilians, creating suffering that extended far beyond the battlefield. The legacy of Vicksburg's siege continued long after the Civil War's end, influencing American military doctrine and serving as a reminder of the prices paid for national unity. The city's suffering and ultimate surrender contributed to the Union victory that preserved the United States as a single nation, but at costs that challenged the humanity of all participants. The siege that starved the city had indeed strengthened a nation's will to win, but it had also demonstrated the terrible price of that victory.